I don't think I did anything wrong. I just leaned on a friend's shoulder when the night got heavy. It wasn't even romantic. But by morning, my clothes were folded in boxes, and my husband was gone. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I'm Isola Trent, and I don't think I did anything wrong. I just leaned on a friend's shoulder when the night got heavy. It wasn't even romantic. We were all laughing, the music was soft, and everyone had a drink in their hand. I'd had one too many maybe, but it wasn't that kind of moment. I remember saying something like, "He just gets me." And people laughed, even took pictures. Evan didn't pull away, and I didn't think twice. He's our friend. That's all. I told myself Mark wouldn't care, that he knew me better than to make it a scene. But when I came home, the house was too quiet. His side of the bed was smooth, his closet half empty, and my suitcase was open on the floor, already packed. I stood there, half dazed, thinking he was bluffing. Maybe he just wanted to scare me into saying sorry. I didn't. Because I still don't think leaning on someone's shoulder counts as betrayal. People need comfort sometimes, and Mark never gave me that anymore. Still, I keep replaying the sound of that zipper closing. Maybe it wasn't anger. Maybe it was preparation. The night felt electric from the moment I stepped out of the car. The rooftop restaurant glowed softly against the dark city sky, lights reflecting off the glass walls and casting warm shadows over the tables. I smoothed my dress and ran a hand through my hair, feeling a rare thrill of excitement. Mark had promised he'd meet me there after finishing his work calls. I knew he would be late, as always, but I didn't mind. The anticipation was part of the fun. Inside, Evan was already at the bar, laughing easily with a few friends. His presence was magnetic, and I felt the familiar pull of being noticed in a way Mark hadn't given me in months. I waved, and he grinned, gesturing for me to join him. I told myself it was harmless, just friendliness, but a small part of me relished the attention. Sophie arrived shortly after, bustling and chatty, dragging a crate of decorations for the dinner party we were helping host afterward. Mark walked in last, his expression calm, composed, polite as always. He kissed my cheek, murmured something about having had a long day, and took the seat beside me. His hand brushed against mine briefly, and I felt the faint warmth of familiarity, but there was a subtle distance in the way he settled into his chair. I ignored it, choosing instead to focus on the conversation around the table, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of music. Evan leaned closer as we talked, laughing at a joke I'd made about work. His arm brushed against mine when he handed me a drink, and I let it linger. It wasn't romance, I told myself. It was comfort, acknowledgement, proof that I still mattered in some way. Sophie nudged me with her elbow and whispered, "Everyone's watching. You look incredible." I smiled, letting the compliment wash over me, feeling that small surge of power that came from being admired, from being seen. After dinner, the restaurant dimmed the lights, and the soft jazz band began to play. Evan moved a chair closer, resting his elbow near mine, and I leaned slightly on his shoulder. It was only for a moment, but the closeness made my heart race. I didn't think about Mark then, didn't imagine how he might be watching from across the room. I was wrapped up in the attention, the energy, the quiet thrill of being noticed. When I finally returned home, the house was quiet, too quiet. Mark's side of the bed was untouched, and 2 mugs sat on the counter, deliberately apart, one clean and one half full. I rolled my eyes at the neatness, telling myself it was just habit. But the faint hum of the printer from the guest room drew my attention. Blank pages slid silently through the tray, the smell of toner marking its presence. I laughed nervously, dismissing it as work, but a small knot of unease settled in my stomach. That night, I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, looking at the likes and comments on the photos from dinner. People were praising me, admiring my confidence. I told myself Mark's silence didn't matter. I was untouchable. But somewhere in the quiet, I could still hear the faint, deliberate tapping of keys from the guest room. It was methodical, controlled, precise, a rhythm I didn't yet understand. And for the first time, I wondered if my small act of leaning on Evan's shoulder might not be as harmless as I had believed. The morning after he didn't come home, I made sure to act normal. That's how you stay in control, by not letting anyone see you sweat. I got Leo ready for school, packed his lunch, and even joked about how Daddy was probably working too hard again. He smiled, but only halfway. Kids notice more than you think. I spent the rest of the day at the community hall, preparing decorations for the charity auction I'd been organizing for weeks. It felt good to be surrounded by people again, bright chatter, and the smell of coffee, instead of the heavy silence at home. Sophie came by around lunch to check in, which meant fishing for gossip. She asked if Mark was still upset about the photo. I rolled my eyes and said he'd get over it. She said, maybe delete it before it causes more drama. I told her deleting it would make me look guilty. People forget that perception is everything. Once you look ashamed, you lose. By mid-afternoon, the event coordinator asked me to post a few teasers online to boost ticket sales. I used one of the group photos from the dinner, yes, the same one with Evan's arm around me, and added a caption about friendship and teamwork. It looked wholesome enough. Within an hour, it had 50 likes and a handful of comments saying how radiant I looked. I scrolled through them on my lunch break, letting each compliment smooth over the unease still stuck under my ribs. When I got home that evening, Mark's car was in the driveway. That surprised me. He usually worked late. Inside, the house looked neat. Too neat. His shoes were lined up perfectly. A small stack of folded laundry sat on the couch, and his laptop was open on the dining table. He didn't look up when I walked in. I told him about the event and how the post was performing online. He nodded, said it was good to keep things professional. Something about the way he said professional felt deliberate, like he was emphasizing a word that had more meaning than it should. I laughed and told him he sounded like my boss. He said, "Someone has to." I sat across from him, trying to bridge the distance. I said I didn't understand why he was acting like a picture was a crime. He said nothing at first, then finally asked if I remembered our wedding vows. I said, of course, and tried to lighten it with a joke, but his expression didn't change. He said, I meant the part about respect. That word again, respect. Everyone acts like it's the same as love, but it isn't. Love is emotional. Respect is performative. You give it because people expect you to, not because you feel it. I told him he was overanalyzing everything. He said calmly, that's what people say when they don't want to face facts. The next morning, he was gone before sunrise again. I found his mug washed and turned upside down on the counter. Mine was still in the sink, half full. It annoyed me that he couldn't just leave it alone like a normal person. He had to make everything symbolic. When I got to work, Sophie had already texted me 3 times about new comments on the photo. She said one of Evan's friends had reposted it with a laughing emoji and the caption, "Caught in 4K." I told her people love to exaggerate. She said, still, you might want to take it down. I ignored her. Let them talk. If you spend your life trying to look innocent, you'll never look confident. Later that day, I saw a missed call from an unknown number. The voicemail was short, a woman's voice saying she was from Mark's office and wanted to confirm some paperwork details for a personal file. That phrase stuck with me. I told myself it was nothing serious, maybe some insurance update or work form, but still, it buzzed in the back of my mind. That evening, when Mark got home, I asked him about it. He said he was reorganizing some accounts. His tone was neutral, like he'd rehearsed it. I said, "You never handle the finances, I do." He said, "Not anymore." Then he opened the fridge and asked if there was dinner. I said, You could at least pretend to care. He said, I care enough to make sure we're covered. I didn't like how cold he sounded, so I tried switching tactics. I said maybe we should plan a weekend trip to reconnect. He said he had commitments coming up. I asked what kind. He said, personal. Again with that word. After he went to bed, I walked past his work desk and noticed a small notebook tucked beneath a file marked Household. When I picked it up, it didn't open. There was a tiny lock on it. Since when did he start locking notebooks? I heard the soft click of the bedroom door behind me and froze. He said quietly, You used to respect my space. I laughed awkwardly and told him I was just curious. He said, Curiosity is fine. Snooping isn't. Then he took the notebook, placed it back under the file, and locked the drawer. The next morning, I decided to call my mother. She always had opinions, especially about Mark. I told her he was acting strange, distant, maybe even paranoid. She said, Men don't like being embarrassed in public, Isola. It's a pride thing. I said, It was one photo. She said, A photo can feel like proof to the wrong eyes. I told her she sounded old-fashioned. She said, Maybe being old-fashioned is what keeps people married. Her words annoyed me, but they also unsettled me. When I hung up, I noticed the faint hum of the printer from the guest room. It kept printing, page after page, though I hadn't seen Mark use it all morning. When I peeked inside, the tray was full of blank sheets. Just paper, nothing on them. I laughed out loud because it looked absurd, but when I reached to pick one up, I smelled faint toner, fresh, like someone had just run test prints to make sure the ink was ready. That night, I asked if he'd printed anything. He said, A few things. I asked what kind. He said, Just documentation. I joked that it sounded like he was building a case. He didn't laugh. He said, You always turn jokes into confessions. I told Sophie about it later over coffee. She said he was probably just trying to guilt-trip me. Men like that love to play the quiet martyr, she said. Ignore him. Let him cool off. You did nothing wrong. I liked hearing that. It reminded me that my version of events still made sense. If enough people agree with you, you can't be wrong. By the end of the week, things looked almost normal again. Mark was polite, almost gentle, but distant in that careful way that makes you feel observed. He started keeping a folder on the counter labeled Utilities. I thought it was just bills, until I saw he'd written the date on the spine in neat ink. He was cataloguing something. I told myself it was harmless, some architect habit spilling into daily life. On Friday, I went with Sophie and Evan to set up the charity auction hall. Evan brought coffee and teased me about how serious I looked with the clipboard. He brushed my arm lightly when he handed me the cup. It was nothing, but it sent a small pulse through me, a reminder that I could still make people react. I caught sight of our reflection in the hall mirror and thought, maybe that's what Mark saw at dinner, the part of me that wasn't his anymore. That night, Mark came home later than usual. Leo was already asleep, and I was watching TV in the living room. He stood by the doorway, looking like he was debating whether to speak. Finally, he said, I saw the new post. I said, The event one? He nodded. Evan commented again. I told him Evan comments on everything. He's just friendly. Mark said, Friendly is a flexible word. I rolled my eyes. You're seeing problems that aren't there. He said, Maybe, or maybe I've started seeing clearly. The air between us went cold. I turned up the TV. He didn't argue, just picked up his laptop and went to the guest room again. The door closed with that same soft click that had started to haunt me. Lying in bed, I scrolled through social media, watching the numbers climb. More likes, more shares, more praise. Every heart icon felt like validation, proof that I was the reasonable one, the fun one, the normal one. Mark's silence couldn't compete with that. Before I fell asleep, I heard the faint sound of typing again. Not frantic, measured, steady, like a man working through a plan. For a moment, I imagined him writing something tender, maybe a letter, maybe an apology, but deep down, I knew that wasn't what he was typing at all. The weekend arrived, and I was ready to reclaim control. Sophie called early Saturday morning, her voice buzzing with excitement. "The brunch crowd's going to love your post," she said. I told her I didn't need anyone else to validate me, but I let her chatter flow anyway. It felt good to be noticed again, to have someone in my corner. The house was quiet, though. Mark had left for his errands early. 2 mugs sat on opposite sides of the kitchen counter, his spotless, mine half-finished. I didn't like it, but I told myself it was just habit. By mid-morning, I decided to head to the community hall to finalize the auction setup. Evan was there already, arranging tables and adjusting centerpieces. He smiled when he saw me and said, "You look unstoppable today." I laughed, telling him it was just caffeine, but I liked the way he said it, the way his eyes lingered longer than necessary. I caught myself leaning a little closer when he handed me a stack of programs, just a fleeting brush of his hand, but enough to feel alive. Sophie arrived a few minutes later with the final boxes of decorations. "We need your magic touch," she said, dragging a crate across the floor. I rolled my eyes playfully, but helped her. My mind kept drifting back to Mark, to the mugs, the calendar alerts, the faint hum of the printer. I told myself he was being dramatic again, that it had nothing to do with me, but deep down, I felt the thrill of power. He couldn't stop me, couldn't control the narrative. Not now, not here. By noon, the hall was full of volunteers and staff, all laughing and moving in controlled chaos. Evan stayed nearby, joking about missing his calling as an event planner. I laughed, enjoying the attention, and I noticed a few volunteers sneaking glances at us. Sophie elbowed me and whispered, "Everyone's watching, you're the star." I smiled, letting the compliment roll over me. Lunch arrived and I sat at a high table with Evan and Sophie. We ordered sandwiches and salads, chatting lightly about work, life, the auction. Evan leaned closer, resting an elbow on the table, his voice low enough that I had to tilt my head to hear him. "You're always this sharp?" he asked. I smiled, said I only worked that hard when people were paying attention. He laughed softly, and I felt that small warmth spread through me. Around 1, the crowd started to settle for a short break. Volunteers gathered near the refreshment table. Evan pulled me aside under the pretense of helping arrange the beverage cart. I let him, and for a moment it felt private. He smiled, and I laughed at something he said, too caught up in the moment to notice the way Sophie was watching from across the room. When I returned to the table, Sophie nudged me and whispered, "That arm around your shoulder earlier, it's going viral online already." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She tapped her phone. A clip of me laughing with Evan had been posted on a local community forum captioned, "Clearly she knows who really gets her." I told her people were reading too much into it. She shrugged, but her eyes sparkled with mischief. Or they're seeing what Mark won't admit. I laughed it off, dismissing the comment. That was my strategy: dismiss, deflect, and keep the story on my terms. But as the afternoon wore on, I started to feel the faint tension creeping back. It wasn't from Evan or Sophie, it was from the way my phone kept vibrating with notifications. The gentle but persistent hum that told me people were watching, judging. Mark called around 3. I didn't answer. His name flashed on the screen, and I told myself I didn't owe him an explanation. He probably just wanted to lecture me again, to make everything about his feelings. I let it go to voicemail and continued setting up the hall. By 4, the event was nearly ready. Tables were aligned, chairs perfectly spaced, name cards in neat rows. Evan handed me a clipboard, and I went around checking each table, feeling that small sense of control, the one I hadn't felt at home in months. I caught sight of my reflection in the large windows, sunlight catching my hair, and I smiled. This was me, confident, admired, uncontained. Then Sophie nudged me again. Look at the comments, she said, pointing at her phone. Someone had shared the clip from earlier, adding, "She's having too much fun. Mark looks foolish." I scrolled through the replies. More people had chimed in, laughing, joking, praising me for living fully. My chest swelled. I told myself it was harmless, that everyone would forget it eventually. Still, a small part of me noticed the echo of my own words, that I was enjoying the humiliation of my husband without realizing how deep it had gone. Evan leaned closer as we packed supplies into a cart. "You're glowing," he said softly. I brushed it off with a laugh, telling him it was the lighting. But his smile lingered. It was a private moment, or so I thought. The event officially started around 6. Volunteers hustled, guests arrived, and I floated between tables, charming donors, answering questions, and maintaining a calm smile. Sophie stayed nearby, occasionally whispering to me about how impressive I looked. Evan hovered, supportive but not too close, though I could feel that invisible tension when he laughed at my jokes, when he leaned in slightly during conversations. Mark didn't arrive. I expected him to, at least for a moment, to watch from the back and feel the gravity of my social presence. But he didn't. The emptiness of his absence became a silent thread weaving through the night. Each compliment, each laugh, each glance from Evan felt amplified against the backdrop of his quiet withdrawal. After the first round of speeches, a few colleagues pulled me aside to comment on the social media buzz from the clip. I smiled, saying it was nothing, just a small moment. But the way they looked at me, like I'd won some invisible contest, I felt a subtle thrill. I whispered to Sophie that Mark could have seen it, that he would have understood. She shook her head. He's watching differently. He's noting. Later, Evan suggested we take a quick break in the courtyard. The cool evening air was sharp against my skin, a contrast to the warm lights inside. He leaned against the railing, and I leaned slightly on his shoulder while we talked. It was fleeting, innocent in my mind, a gesture of comfort after the long day. But I could feel a sense of electricity, a tiny rush that made me smile. Inside, Sophie took a discreet photo. I didn't notice until later when my phone buzzed with a notification. The image had already been shared online. The caption read, "Clearly she's got someone who gets her." I stared at it, half amused, half unnerved. I told myself it was nothing, just attention, nothing more. But I felt that small twist in my stomach, that thrill of being seen outside my husband's eyes. The evening drew on. Drinks were poured, donations counted, and speeches concluded. I floated between groups, laughing at jokes, sharing small stories, basking in the spotlight. I felt powerful, untouchable, as if the world had finally aligned with my version of reality. Mark's absence felt like a badge, proof that I had agency he couldn't diminish. By 10, the hall began to empty. Volunteers packed supplies, and I stayed behind with Evan and Sophie to tidy up the remaining tables. I laughed at a joke Sophie made about the drama of married life. Evan smiled at me, and I felt that small warmth, that invisible current connecting us in the empty hall. When I finally got home, the lights were dim, and the house smelled faintly of coffee. Mark's laptop was open on the dining table. I glanced at it, noting the folder labeled Archive A on the screen. I laughed lightly, probably just organizing files, nothing more. But the neatness, the order, the silence, it was deliberate. I set down my coat and called Sophie. She said people were commenting on the new post from earlier, praising me for living boldly and owning the night. I smiled. I told her Mark didn't understand. She laughed. He's always too serious. He'll come around. I hoped she was right, but part of me knew he wasn't the type to simply come around. Late that night, I walked past the kitchen and noticed 2 mugs on the counter. His, spotless and empty. Mine, half-finished and cold. The separation annoyed me. I told myself it was symbolic, meaningless. But the faint hum of the printer in the guest room drew my attention. Blank sheets fed through at regular intervals, a faint smell of toner marking their passage. I froze. I told myself it was just office work, planning, nothing personal. But when I glanced toward the bedroom, the door to the guest room clicked softly. I realized that someone was inside, organizing, cataloging, recording. I laughed nervously, telling myself he couldn't be that meticulous, that this was paranoia. But a small knot formed in my stomach. By midnight, I was in bed, scrolling through the comments on my phone. Hundreds of likes, dozens of shares. Every heart, every thumbs up felt like a tiny victory. I told myself it proved I was right, that Mark was overreacting, that being seen, admired, noticed, it wasn't betrayal. But as I closed my eyes, I couldn't stop hearing the faint tap of keys from the guest room. Methodical, controlled, deliberate. And I realized, somewhere deep down, this wasn't just observation. This was preparation, quiet and exact, for something I couldn't yet see. The next week felt like a delicate balance between control and chaos. I told myself I was fine, that life could carry on as normal, but Mark's absence at the weekend event left a residue I couldn't ignore. I spent Monday morning going through emails and calls for the charity, but my attention kept drifting. Every notification, every ping on my phone, felt like a small alarm I couldn't name. Sophie arrived mid-morning, carrying a box of table decorations. "You need to lighten up," she said, plopping the box on the counter. I laughed, saying I was fine, but she smirked knowingly. "People are talking," she whispered. "The post, the night at the hall, it's everywhere online. Mark is handling it differently." I frowned. "Handling what?" "You know," she said, waving vaguely at the air. "Your little shoulder moment. People are commenting, sharing, joking about him. He's noticing." I rolled my eyes. Mark notices everything. That doesn't mean anything. But even as I said it, I felt a twinge of unease. There was a difference between noticing and tracking, and the way he had been lately suggested more than mere observation. By afternoon, I decided to run errands, hoping to distract myself. The supermarket was quiet, and I waved to a few neighbors as I passed. I caught myself imagining Mark observing me, calculating my every step, imagining the silent tension growing in the house he had left behind. I shook it off, telling myself I was just being dramatic. At home, I found the house unusually tidy. His shoes were neatly aligned, the mail stacked in a precise row. I called out his name, but no response. 2 mugs sat on the counter again, separated as if marking territory. I told myself it was a habit, a quirk, but I felt the weight of intent behind it. That evening, I went to the balcony to check my phone. Evan had texted, joking about grabbing dinner next week. I smiled at the message, leaned against the railing, and let the breeze play through my hair. Sophie appeared moments later with a cup of coffee. "You're glowing," she said. "He's going to have a fit when he sees the new post." I laughed. "Mark? Please. He can't touch me here." But the truth was, a small part of me felt the tension. I didn't want to admit that his calm had shifted from passive to deliberate, that each silent action carried weight. Later that night, I noticed the printer humming again in the guest room. Blank pages slid quietly, rhythmically. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe he was organizing work documents. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of my life quietly documented in ways I hadn't anticipated. At dinner, I tried to talk about the auction preparations, about the volunteers and the schedule. He nodded but didn't engage. I mentioned a funny comment someone had made online about the clip with Evan, expecting a reaction. He said, "Comments are fleeting." I frowned. "So you're ignoring everything?" "Not ignoring," he said evenly. "Observing." I laughed lightly, trying to diffuse the tension. "You're acting like a detective." He didn't smile. Sometimes details matter more than drama. Afterward, I went upstairs to check on Leo. He was quietly reading, glancing occasionally at the hallway where Mark's side of the room remained empty. I asked if he missed Daddy. He shrugged. He's busy. I nodded, but the hollow sound of the words echoed in my mind. Even the child noticed the shift. Even the smallest witness could feel the tension I refused to name. I went to bed later, scrolling through my phone. People were still commenting on the posts from the auction hall. More likes, more jokes, more admiration. I smiled, feeling a temporary sense of victory. Outside validation was mine, and I told myself Mark's absence or quiet disapproval didn't matter. But then I heard it, the soft, consistent tapping of the keyboard in the guest room. Calm, deliberate, not frantic. I held my breath listening. I tried to tell myself it was just work, that he had deadlines to meet, but I couldn't shake the awareness that it wasn't about work. It had been weeks of careful, quiet preparation, and every sound was part of a pattern I wasn't supposed to see yet. The next morning, I found a small sticky note on the kitchen counter. Bring forms. I laughed at the simplicity, thinking it was a leftover from some work errand, but when I glanced at the counter closer, I saw his laptop open with a spreadsheet minimized. A small USB stick lay nearby, labeled with a recent date. I frowned, feeling an edge of unease. I called Sophie that morning. She was excited about the auction and the latest round of online attention. "You're unstoppable," she said. "People are loving the clips, the posts. They're all talking about you." I laughed again, brushing off the creeping anxiety. "Mark can't touch this. I control the story." She hesitated. "Be careful. I don't think he's doing nothing." "What do you mean?" "Just watch." I dismissed her concern, but even as I did, I noticed the small details at home. The 2 mugs, the neat piles of mail, the locked drawer in his office, the faint smell of toner lingering in the night air. Patterns that had once seemed innocuous now carried weight, subtle signs that something deliberate was unfolding. That evening, as I prepared a simple dinner, I heard his car in the driveway. He walked in quietly, placed his keys on the counter, and went straight to the guest room without a word. I followed him, trying to catch a smile, a signal, anything. But he just closed the door softly behind him. I stood in the hallway, breathing lightly, trying to rationalize his behavior. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he was focused on work. Maybe he needed space. But then I remembered the small notes, the locked drawer, the USB stick. Every detail pointed to more than just avoidance. I went to the kitchen and noticed the calendar on the fridge. A new entry in his precise handwriting. Downtown 9:25. He hadn't mentioned it. I didn't ask. I told myself it was another errand. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else, something that was part of a plan I wasn't yet allowed to see. Later, I called Evan to decompress, to feel that small connection I craved. He joked about the post, about Sophie's commentary, about how people loved seeing me out of the house and in the spotlight. I laughed, feeling the warmth of attention, the reassurance of someone noticing me. I told myself it was harmless. When I finally went to bed, I heard it again, the gentle tapping of keys, the quiet shuffle of paper. Not frantic, not emotional, not a plea or an argument, just methodical, deliberate, calm. I tried to sleep, tried to convince myself it was just organization, but every tap reminded me that something unseen was taking shape, quietly, and my comfort, my control, my carefully maintained story was being observed in ways I couldn't yet measure. I closed my eyes, and the sound continued. For the first time, I realized that this wasn't just attention, observation, or even judgment. It was preparation. And no matter how confident I felt, no matter how much praise or validation came from Sophie, Evan, or the online crowd, it wouldn't stop what was quietly being built around me, piece by piece, in the quiet hours when I wasn't watching. By midweek, the pattern was undeniable. Mark moved through the house with a calm precision that made every corner, every surface, feel deliberate. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just his way of coping, his quiet method of reclaiming some semblance of order in our lives. But even as I rationalized it, I noticed the small things. 2 mugs on the counter again, separate as always. The stack of mail perfectly aligned by type and date. A locked drawer in the study I'd never seen him use. The faint hum of the printer from the guest room at odd hours, pages sliding silently through the tray. I spent the day at the auction hall with Sophie, putting the finishing touches on table decorations. Evan hovered near the back, chatting and joking, occasionally brushing against my shoulder when handing me programs. I let it happen. It wasn't a romantic gesture, I told myself. It was just proximity, just a way to feel seen. The volunteers laughed at some of our exchanges, and the energy in the room made me feel untouchable. Mark's absence had created space, and I filled it without hesitation. Sophie nudged me at one point. "You're glowing," she whispered, leaning close. "People are talking about you again. That clip is still spreading." I smiled, brushing off the comment, pretending I wasn't aware. I had to maintain the image of control. If I showed the slightest unease, the illusion would crack. Returning home that evening, the house felt unusually silent. I called out to Mark, but no answer. His car was in the driveway, but the hallway light was off, the bed untouched on his side. Only the faint smell of coffee lingered in the kitchen, and the printer's hum was quiet. 2 mugs sat on the counter as usual, his clean, mine half full and cold. I rolled my eyes at the meticulousness, telling myself it was just habit, nothing more. When he finally appeared in the kitchen, he didn't look at me. He poured coffee into his mug with careful, deliberate motions and set it opposite mine. I tried to make a joke about the distance between the two, but he didn't respond. I asked if he had a long day, and he said simply, "It was productive." I followed him to the guest room, trying to catch some sign of warmth, but he remained focused, opening a folder labeled Utilities and leafing through it with quiet concentration. I peered over his shoulder, curious, and asked what he was doing. He said nothing at first, then finally, "Preparing." "Preparing what?" I asked, trying to mask the edge of panic in my voice. He looked at me evenly. "Everything." I laughed nervously. "Everything? You mean bills?" "They're part of it," he said. "Everything matters." I shook my head, telling myself he was overreacting. It was just a folder, just organization. But his calmness, his exactitude, gnawed at me. I had spent weeks manipulating the narrative in my favor, convincing friends, colleagues, and even myself that I had done nothing wrong. Yet here he was, silent, methodical, letting the world around him remain normal while he built something entirely separate, something I couldn't yet see. Later, Leo asked if Daddy would be home for dinner. I told him yes, hoping the lie would feel true enough to settle the boy. He nodded but didn't look convinced. Kids notice the small things, the empty chair, the quiet tone, the lack of ordinary routine. Leo's unease reminded me that this wasn't just about me anymore. That night, I attempted to draw Mark into conversation, hoping to regain some foothold. I asked about his day, about the errands he had run, about anything that might open a crack. He answered politely, but without inflection. I tried to laugh at a joke, and he smiled briefly, but the warmth I remembered from him was gone. His eyes were calm, measured, unreadable. I decided to push boundaries in small ways, testing whether he was truly detached. I mentioned Evan's name in passing, in the context of the auction, noting how helpful he had been. I expected some flicker of emotion, perhaps irritation or jealousy, but Mark didn't react. He simply said, "I see." "I see what?" I pressed, trying to elicit more. "Everything," he said softly, closing the folder and placing it neatly back in the drawer. I felt my chest tighten. That one word carried weight, authority, and warning. I tried to remind myself that I was still in control, that his calmness, didn't diminish the sway I held over our social circles. I told Sophie about it later, over coffee. She was fascinated. "He's plotting," she said. I laughed, telling her she was reading too much into it, but part of me felt a small prickle of unease, the kind that grows quietly when you refuse to admit the truth. By Friday, the signs were everywhere. The USB stick labeled by date sat in plain view on his desk, innocuous but deliberate. The locked drawer in the study remained closed, a physical barrier I couldn't breach. 2 mugs, separate corners, the faint smell of toner in the night. Each was a small signal, each part of the framework he was quietly establishing. I tried one last manipulative effort that evening. I told him he was being dramatic, that people made too much of a harmless interaction at a party, that I was justified in leaning on a friend for support. I said I didn't understand why he couldn't just let it go, why he had to act as though the world was collapsing around him. He looked at me evenly. "I'm not acting," he said. "I'm preparing, and it's time this is handled properly." "Properly?" I asked, trying to sound incredulous but failing to hide the edge in my voice. "You mean like, what, a lecture? A conversation?" "No," he said simply. "Properly." The finality in his tone made my stomach drop. I realized then that he had shifted from passive observation to deliberate planning. Weeks of silence, of seemingly inconsequential actions, had been leading to this moment. I had thought his calm meant weakness, that he lacked the will to act. I had been wrong. Leo wandered into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. "Mum, is Daddy mad at me?" he asked quietly. I shook my head, trying to mask my own fear. "No, honey, he's not mad." But even as I said it, I felt the tension in the room. It wasn't anger, it wasn't hostility, it was a quiet, inexorable determination I had never seen before. Mark packed lightly that night, just a small envelope, a folder tucked under his arm, and his laptop bag. He didn't speak much, only reminded me to ensure Leo was ready for school tomorrow. He kissed the boy on the forehead, a soft gesture, but it carried weight. Not affection, not warmth, only acknowledgement. I watched him leave, feeling a mix of disbelief and frustration. I called Sophie immediately. "He's bluffing," I told her. "It's just a threat, nothing more. He won't do anything." Sophie hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," I said. "I still control the narrative. I've always controlled it." But deep down, I couldn't shake the knot in my stomach. Every precise motion he had made over the past weeks, the separate mugs, the locked drawers, the USB stick, the calendar entries, had been part of a meticulous, quiet build-up. And now, with him leaving the house carrying only a small envelope and saying he would handle it properly, I realized that control was slipping through my fingers in ways I hadn't anticipated. I went to bed that night, scrolling through social media, looking at the likes, the comments, the messages from friends. I told myself I was still untouchable. People supported me. I was right. Yet in the quiet of the empty house, with the faint hum of the printer from earlier still echoing in my mind, I felt the first stirrings of fear that my version of events might not be enough, that my careful performance of innocence and charm might soon collide with something far more deliberate, far more final. For the first time, I wondered whether weeks of silence, of observation, of subtle documentation had built a structure I couldn't break. And I realized that when Mark said he would handle it properly, he didn't mean a conversation. He meant exactly what he said. Properly, legally, publicly. The courthouse lobby buzzed with quiet activity. I walked in, expecting an argument, a conversation, maybe even an apology. Instead, Mark stood calmly with a court officer. The officer handed me a sealed envelope, legal papers detailing separation, custody arrangements, and property division. My hands shook as I read, realizing his silence had been preparation, his calm deliberate. Everything I thought I controlled had already shifted, and there was no turning back.